All right. Let's see if we can get this quiz done in one sitting. Again, there are 30 questions, and of course, it's open book. Um, and make sure you remember, don't try to backtrack and things along those lines. If you have questions or things freeze up, you let me know right away. Um, if I reset the quiz, however, you'll have to re-answer the questions. I can't just sort of go through, although in a sense I can. I can copy if I have and paste what you responded before things went foobar, and I might just do that. Um, and then fill in the blanks as we go along. But as a rule, I just reset, um, and then you have to rethink. Um, Now, in the very beginning of the novel, we find that Daisy's real name is Elizabeth, a name she hates, probably because she associates it with her father, um, and 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 that part of her that she doesn't like. Remember, she refers to herself as a murderer, and has some very, very serious psychological issues in the very beginning of the novel. But she prefers Daisy, but her actual um, name is Elizabeth. But she's very quick, you notice, when she first gets there to say no to Piper. Don't call me that. Even though she takes an immediate liking to Piper, and as she kind of says as along, you know, why not? Everybody does. She's irresistible. Well, Daisy's aunt, Penn, Penn, is her mother's younger sister, um, and it turns out that her bedroom has I think that she has even sees pictures when she talks to her aunt of her beautiful, beautiful mother who was so happy um, when she found out she was pregnant with Daisy. And Daisy, of course, has to get over the fact that she's responsible for her mother's death. Um, when um, when she arrives at the English house in the country, this sort of magical house, um, Daisy is 15 years old. She is a year younger than Osbert and older than Isaac and Edmund. Keep that in mind. She's 15, which means probably by the end she's 21 when she returns after 6 years. Um, the two twins are like might kind of look alike in some ways, but they are a lot different. Um, Isaac says little, and he's kind of holds things together in some ways. He's always he feels a lot more, shall we say, comfortable around animals, and he basically can communicate them in a way that Edmund can communicate with humans. Isaac, the non-talkative Isaac, uh, relates well to animals, and as we learn, Piper tells us, and this continues at the end, that people will have him come over and and look at animals that people are deciding, and he seems to be able to empathize with animals, which is part of the wonder of that magical family. The So that Edmund on the other hand is um, more comfortable with people, and he wears his emotions right on his face, and he's just this beautiful, beautiful, innocent, and very, I think, vulnerable in the long run young man who sees horrors that will take a lifetime um, to heal if they can. It's sort of like the end of the Hunger Games in this particular story for YA. When the damage is done, one of the important things about this book that you everything's just not honky dory, happily ever after as you suspect it might be with this wonderful house in the country that is just seems like straight out of a fairy tale. As I said, Daisy has issues. um, that I mean, she doesn't eat. She probably anorexic, bulimic. I would assume anorexic. Wants to be thin. And the irony is, at the end of the book, she's as thin as everybody else because they've all suffered from starvation, and she finally wants to eat. But at the time when she arrives, the father has married Davina, who is pregnant, and she will eventually give birth to Leonora, the perfect child. She calls her, I like it, she calls her Davina the diabolical. Yeah, which points to, as I said at another venue, the starkiness of her. Um, she makes wonderfully ironic statements that are part of her self deprecating at times and certainly self effacing personality. Um, the humor is something that she survives by in many ways, but it also makes the book more bearable and less just completely gloomy. Now, early in the novel, Aunt Pen leaves for Oslo, Norway, um, and she's going to give a lecture about what she calls, Daisy describes as, and she likes to put things in caps, imminent threat of war. Now, again, we know this kind of threat has been going on for 5 years, and Daisy, and nobody talks about it. It's just out there. But she's gone over there. She either works for the federal government or she's a member of an NGO of some kind, a non government agency that's working to try to um, stop the um, the rise of the terrorism and things like that. Now, we learn quickly too that Daisy's mother um, got she died giving birth to Daisy. The reason that Daisy calls herself a murderer. Once again, she has a lot of psychological baggage that she's carrying, and in a way, Edmund can see into it as we come to find out. Now, the day after Aunt Pen uh, goes to Oslo, a terrorist bomb exploded in a London train station, and in Daisy's way, she says where 700 or 70,000 people were killed, and that's pointing to another reality I didn't address in the introduction. But this book always questions the truth of news reporting. As you can see it today, they start out and you have all these outlandish things. They go at it all day long and all day long, and it says contradictory information. But also in here later on, she'll find out, for instance, with the apparent spread of smallpox, that in a way the government or the territorial army has put out that story just to help control people. So, in other words, in the long run, um, boy, you just don't know what to believe in the media and sometimes even from adults. Um, but the bomb does explode, but there's no real effect on them yet out in their, um, almost hermetically sealed place. The mother has money in the bank. They can go and get food, and Piper's very good about food, although she does have a little trouble later on with mushrooms when she and Daisy are trying to get back from the place to which they were sequestered, um, the long journey home. Um, but when she arrives at Aunt Pen's house, as one of the noticeable things about her is the fact that she's incredibly thin. She doesn't like her body. These issues are implied as we go along because Edmund's looking at her, remember, and at one point, because she's falling in love with him, she just doesn't appreciate it at the time. Um, Edmund wants her to eat stuff, and she said that she tried the bacon, but it was like tasted like animal, and so she refuses to eat. So the food doesn't, she is not interested in it. By the end of the novel, now she'll be thin, as I said before, because everybody else is, because they've been starved. But the difference is she enjoys food. Um, and it is true that Edmund just seems to be able, the way he looks at her, kind of a soulful look, able to read some of Daisy's thoughts. Um, and as it moves along, um, after Aunt Pen leaves for Oslo, and the war begins in a big way, and England, at least that part of it, is occupied. Um, Society basically comes to a halt. At this particular point, when things are getting bad, back at the farm, Daisy and her younger cousin Edmund fall very much in love. Uh, and this love is going to sustain her all the way when everything seems hopeless to even into, by the end of the novel, the future. This is how I live now. Um, Now, the war lasted a number of weeks afterwards. They've been kind of living on their own. Piper goes out and finds food. They can fish. They can do a number of different things. There's vegetables. And she has her little Boy Scout book about Osbert, the older brother's book. He's gone off to school when the mother left. A man named Dr. Jameson comes to the house and asks for drugs, especially antibiotics, because again, the thread of society has broken, and there's nothing coming out of London to help people with things like diabetes or infections. Not necessarily. There's no smallpox that we know of, but Dr. Jameson, and I don't bring this up later. Um, like 2 days after him, the soldiers come up, and so she's wondering it because he was worried that kids, 15-year-olds and 14 and 8-year-olds were living on their own in the country, although they're very self-sufficient. He's an adult, another one of those ineffectual in some ways. The army will show up, and that's when they're separated. But Dr. Jameson, she will see him later on at the Macus massacre where the boys were sent, and she'll say it was she has seen dead people by that time, but it was the first time for her to see someone dead whom she actually knew. See, I like it happens a couple times. So this is one of those details that are interesting on a number of different levels. But the night before they get what they call sequestered, they're going to be sent out. Children gathered in not concentration camps, but camps where the territorial forces, that would be the British reserves, are working sort of with the enemy, um, the ones who have invaded, and basically holding 16 million people hostage, waiting for the other British troops to come down, the so-called occupation. Um, the night they sleep together, and I love it, is that they sleep wrapped. Daisy spends the night wrapped in black sheep blankets with her lover, her cousin, first cousin Edmund. I just love the kind of the idea of how they are, black sheeps compared to other children their age and things along those lines. We know our usual kind of definition of the black sheep of the family and things along those lines. Well, it fits with them. There's a certain, in the way that it's portrayed in the story, and her own naivete, and just the extent to which she uh, invades her. And I don't mean that in a strictly sexual way, but that she is just completely consumed um, by Edmund, and um, one assumes that it's a reciprocal relationship, which becomes evident certainly by the end of the novel. And now on the way to Reston Bridge, which is where they're going. Remember, along the way, she's trying to figure out where she is all the time because she's already thinking about what Edmund said, come back. Um, we'll meet here. On the way to Reston Bridge with Piper and Jet. The dog does come along. Daisy sees, really, the first physical effects of the war, including tanks and the enemy at checkpoints for the first time. Um, and this is where the reality of what's really going on in the world outside their little magical place um, breaks through. Uh, now, they stay in Reston Bridge with at the house of Major McEvoy, and while she's there, I mean, here we have Daisy, really, thinking beyond her own self, if you will, her own feelings of self pity and loathing, but she's thinking of Piper and Edmund, and of course Isaac, and getting back, in a sense, back home. And Daisy is looking right away for um, the tools, and one of the things she sees is a map, and she tears the page of a map and hides it in her underwear, um, as presumably where no one will look. But again, she's looking and thinking of ways to leave, and because she's looking, she'll find things. Now, um, Major McEvoy, and in the house where Piper and Daisy live with the mother, with McEvoy's husband. Um, he devotes considerable time to organizing a field hospital for the local people. It turns out the regular hospitals are, I mean, they're overrun with all the other effects of war, which is wounded people in London. People have been uh, we don't know exactly all that went on, whether there was some kind of biologicals. There's a hint that there was a dirty bomb, which the movie makes more specific. Um, so uh, he's trying, among his other things, is he's a good guy. I mean, he's has a nasty job as a reservist, territorial now. Now, according to Major McGovey, the enemy forces they just call them the enemy. They occupied England after the major part of the British Army, in fact, got lured um, into crises on the other side of the world. So the major expeditionary forces, and one assumes perhaps for France, we don't know all the details because we center our focus on the lives of these youngsters. Um, and when England, of course, becomes basically defenseless in many respects, and then the terrorist bombs go off, and these other people invade. Now, I said before that the relationship is um, between Edmund and Daisy, which some would frown upon, but there's a certain purity about it, and there's a certain kind of they belong together connectedness where they both find each other, and she thrives uh, and survives, if you will, because she does believe that Edmund visits her from time to time in a sort of almost sleep and things along these lines, and she swears she can smell his tobacco, as Edmund, the young Edmund, smokes. Uh, and she says she can feel the smooth glide of his skin. So there is this communication that seems to be going over the difference. Now, they're stuck in this house. Piper, the dog, sleeps under the bed, comes out for food. Jet and Piper, um, they find work, and I mean, everybody falls in love with Piper, but Jet is also a herder, um, and he's been trained in whistle for whistles, and Piper, she calls him the dog whisperer, um, can help everybody by bringing in the cows 10 at a time or so. There are lots of cows in the area for the milking. Remember, there's no electricity, so you can't do the usual industrial type of low labor milkings. But now it has to all be done by hand, which poses considerable problems because milk, there's no refrigeration either. So all those things become much more complicated. But Jet becomes and Piper become the great heroes, and Daisy, ironically enough, given her revulsion for it, works gathering food, first apples and beans, um, and and is she befriends a woman in her 40s, I believe early 40s, and um, talks to her about various things. And there's a young man named Joe who uh, is very interested in her in a way that she's not interested, and she kind of pushes off his advances. Well, that Joe has a mouth on him, and when they're going through, this is how real it starts to become for her, um, more and more. And one of the things that happen is that Joe mouths off as they're going. He's pissed off. You get the feeling a lot of people are angry in the countryside, and some of them have arms. And the major's job and the other reservists is to try to mitigate violence as long as the enemy or the occupiers aren't feeling threatened, because of course there's more people than them. Then they're willing, to not to let the military reservists control as much as they can. As long as they do that and keep the civilians from fighting, then uh, the enemy is more than happy just to let things go. And we realize that when we see that the enemy soldiers at the checkpoints are just kind of just sitting there with their guns strapped. Yeah, right, go on, go on, go on. And Joe is just there sitting there having a cigarette, you imagine, and just talking. And Joe starts calling them sons of bitches and all kinds of other things. And I mean, it's just the scene is just unnerving because they don't, show great anger. They just take the arm off the shoulder, and points, and they blow his face off, and the blood and everything is. Poor Piper is there, and also um, Daisy sees this, and the boy is not completely dead, and the poor major trying to do, she says, what he probably thinks is right, gets off the back of the truck to go and see if he can assist the young boy, and the guards just open up and kill both of them, and then just go about basically smoking a cigarette and talking. Um, and so you can see the escalating violence the young girls experience. Now, unfortunately for them, after Joe's death, the locals, and with their hidden hunting rifles or whatever they might have, they start to revolt against the enemy. And Frankie, Corporal Francis, gathers up the two, not the dog, uh, who will manage in the long run to find Jet, find his way back, but the wife of the major who's dead, and they get in a car and drive off to a place where everybody seems to have a plan in case of anything, where they would join up. And so she finds herself, the two girls, Piper and Daisy, and the major's wife. So they're like around 100 soldiers, which of course makes her feel vulnerable, but um, they're protected. Of course, the soldiers just all want to be Piper's uh, bigger brother, and they don't. There's no threat of rape or anything like that with Daisy, but she did at the major's. Now, again, she'd take the piece of a map, put it in her underwear, and when she leaves, she finds the major a compass. So she steals the compass from the major's house. He won't be needing it, obviously. He's dead. Um, but again, she's preparing as best she can for finding her way home. And so the only thing she has at that point is the map, the piece of the map, the major's compass, and the knife, a small knife that she used with fruit picking. Now, I got a little ahead of myself because Boz, B-A-Z, is a soldier whom Daisy and Piper knew at the farm, and he takes it upon himself to guard them, if you will, and I love it that they all love Piper because she incites that kind of response, the paternal response, and uh, and so he just won't basically leave their side. And she says that uh, that Boz, the soldier, reminds Daisy of Jet, the dog, because of the way he occasionally looked over to make sure they were safe. And that's what the dog did, the guard dog. And Boz, when when the real revolt come, placing the soldiers and especially the children, she has a discussion with him. He's one of these young men who's very frank with her. Says, what are the chances of violence if I stay? What are the chances if uh, Piper and I take off on our own? He's very upfront, saying they're both problematic, but he helps them. Um, and he makes a pack for them and takes them, not a pact, but he puts some stuff together and pack pieces of rope, some plastic that they can use to protect themselves from the rain. And also, one of the other things is because it is dangerous, a gun, a pistol in the packet. Now, one of the things I didn't mention, because it's not on the quiz, but one of the other kinds of things of preparation at the farm was that when she was working and got to know the soldiers, what they helped her learn how to shoot a gun. And if you're going to be in a hostile environment, that's a good thing to know. But on the way back, they go on many, many of the trails. They do not run into, and the worst thing that happens to them is eating bad mushrooms. Um, they sleep when they can. They take their time, and they eventually find the river. Um, and they know from the map and whatnot that that is the river that will take them home. And so they will follow that river. Um, they're not attacked by anybody. They're very careful, and they do stop at Gateshead Lane, which she had learned was the name of where the boys were from, the major. And they see foxes. She doesn't know what to make of them at first, realizes that a massacre has taken place there. And so she sees the foxes, the gnawing on the victims of the massacre. Um, she sees the person she thinks is Dr. Jameson, the first person um, killed whom she knows. And she's pretty sure that she knows. And it's obvious that they were gunned down. Um, and Daisy and poor Piper find the emaciated body of Little Ding, the goat. And in the long run, this is the only shot she fires um, on her return. It's not a shot to kill an enemy. It is to put the poor goat out of its misery. There's nothing they can do to save it. So she shoots the goat. But she doesn't see Isaac or Edmund there. And it turns out, of course, um, in the long run, you find at the end, as you will, that Edmund and Isaac had originally escaped, and Isaac separated from Edmund, and Edmund felt because of the people he knew at the camp that he had to go back, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But after their long journey, this is an interesting one, is that uh, The house, most of it looks trashed. They decide, well, they're not going to stay there. And so they walk to the mostly hidden lambing uh, barn and find that it's completely untouched. The long run, then, remember they had gone there one night and the blankets are still there. That perhaps if they had stayed there um, for I think it's 4 months that passed from the time they were sequestered till they got back. You can look up that detail. The irony is that they may have been able to actually just stay there, and no one would have found them. Um, now they the one of the things she finds out the room she stayed in miraculously no one had even touched it. It's an interesting thing that's but in the main a lot of the rooms they were trashed or otherwise the furniture was moved around, um, but they have to eat, and Piper's pretty good at finding food. And here we have the great irony is that she's eating by the end. They turn to the country home after some 5 months, I believe it is, after the soldiers force them to leave. um, we'll go with 5 months unless I find anything later. Uh, but what the irony is that at the end, um, Daisy kills and cleans trout that Piper prepares for dinner, and she enjoys the trout, and I think it's mixed with the potatoes and hazelnuts and things along those lines. So she's actually eating now, and she says the poached trout was just stunningly delicious. Um, Completely different from, for instance, the bacon in the very beginning. Now, who doesn't like bacon? Come on. At any rate, so she's eating now, which suggests something had changed a great deal. And it's at that time, suddenly, they're there for a while. No Isaac, no Edmund. We don't know what's going on. And there's a telephone call. The telephone suddenly is working, and it's her father. And he has a lot of connections. We come to find out he's quite wealthy. He's been spending tons of money on the need for psychiatrists, something that the stepmother says about, oh, Lenore is not going to cost us anything like, who over there. As she goes home, um, and it's kind of a medical thing, a medical emergency that he's managed to somehow, with all his connections, because nobody's flying. And she goes back and is in a hospital. We think it's kind of maybe a psychological ward because they're wondering about, is she going to commit suicide? Is she going to do this? Is she going to do that? And you can read, I mean, she does go home for a while, but then strikes completely out on her own and works in a library. Um, and the irony, that's not irony, but it takes, although I think the occupation is done over in 9 months. Still, the war is breaking out all over the place, and it looks like guerrilla kind of stuff. And there's this horrible, horrible trying to rectify the situation, which may well resemble something like what goes on in Iraq with the Shia and the Sunni and ISIL, and just throw everything together to try to get that all figured out. No tourists are allowed to go anywhere, and it takes 6 years for the war to finally end, and Daisy is able to fly home, where she sees Piper, who's uh, thinking of getting married now to a guy that's going to become a doctor, and she still just loves Daisy. And Isaac's there, and they have a garden going for vegetables. But Edmund, scarred literally and figuratively, you can look up the difference between those two. I should say one figuratively burns with passion, but one literally burns toast. So he's has scars from nobody's sure what, um, but he grows flowers, and there's a certain read carefully a certain thing about the flowers. He's obsessed with the flowers, and eventually she tells Edmund why he left. And he says, okay. And in the end, there's a sense that she's starting to communicate with him. But she realizes, because of their bond, I think, she realizes something about him that the others don't see. And it's not on the quiz. The quiz asks you about the flowers that he focuses all his time on. The idea is that he's been emotionally scarred, horribly scarred, because he saw the massacre. And if you think of his gentle nature and all the things associated with him, the effects of the war on everybody um, don't just go away in a day. I mean, Edmund's work in progress, and she says at the end, that's how she lives her life now. The reciprocal bond, what he did for her directly and indirectly, and she will stay, we assume, in England on that now farm where they're sort of trying to grow their own food and all these other things they're learning out in the countryside. So, a sort of happy ending, not unlike the end of, as I mentioned earlier, a movie like The Hunger Games, where you have the teenagers who overcome many of the obstacles, but remain affected by what happened. That's one of the reasons people don't like the ending of the Hunger Games, because it's not just happy, happy. And this, if you want to think of that as a fairy tale about living in the magic farm and things like that, love does, in the end, can heal. But Edmund's not going to just wake up one morning and not have any scars. Many of them are going to be visible for the rest of his life. Okay, everyone, do a good job on the quiz over this very